Righty, good morning. Welcome all. Happy first Sunday of July, 2023. First Sunday of the second half of the year. So we are moving and shaking. Well, Tehachapi was shaking. They just had an earthquake. Yeah, 3.5 or something earlier in the week. Yeah. Or Tehachapi.
Really?
Yeah. So welcome to our Sunday school study. I can now say adult class because we got another class, so make sure you're in the right class here. Feel free to hop back and forth if you want to check all the classes out. We're kind of open with that. We're not that very strict on those kind of things. But welcome. We are going through the Bible. We are in the age of the patriarchs, so it would help if I grabbed my Bible. And we are in the closing time frame of the book of Genesis. So we will be picking up in Genesis chapter 47. I'd like to find your way there. So we are at the time where the family of Jacob, whose name is also Israel, is now settled in under the leadership of Joseph, number 2 guy in Egypt, and all sorts of good stuff is happening there. So we are we just kind of wrapped up the year 1660 BC. So we are going to move on from there. So real quick, the usual stuff happening here. I'm not going to go to China just yet. I'll say that for what we're about to do. So we've seen that we now have in Egypt, Pharaoh, pull this up here. We now have one single Pharaoh, because Senuseret III has passed away, leaving his son Amenemhat III to be the sole king pharaoh in the land of Egypt and over all their domain. So Joseph's pharaoh, his father has since passed, he is now ruling by himself over all. So relying on Joseph, his number 2 guy, all the more. We have over in Assyria, see, we King Sargon the First still, I believe. Do we get to it's
Amenemhat.
It sounds like Dr. Seuss. There's I forget what the technical term is, but there's a category of words where if it reads the same frontwards and backwards, like race car, you read it forward, read it backwards, it says this exact same thing. Well, the biggest one I learned in school was the sentence, or it's not even a sentence, it's a phrase. A man, a plan, a canal, Panama. You say that backwards, it's a man, a plan, a canal, Panama.
Oh, okay.
Who has time to think of this? I don't know.
Because I can do things like what I just did.
Yeah, the mnemonics of how I can remember this. Yeah. So I've heard it pronounced Amenemhat or something like that. I call him Amenemhat, so that's, yeah. Amenemhat, yeah. And of course, these are the Greek versions of their names. It's not even what they call themselves. So Ramses never called himself Ramses, and no one called him Ramses. That's the Egyptian version. So yeah. So anyway, there you go. Yeah. So yeah, they used all that. Yeah. Right. So let's see, where's this guy? Sargon the First. Here he is on number. There we go. Oh yeah, towards the last here. So so Sargon the First. I got him. There we are. So as we saw last week, here's this guy being presented to their false god, Sargon the First there, and the cuneiform writing of the area in the language of Akkadian is the big popular one. Over in the southern part of Sumer, Shinar, Mesopotamia, we have Isin and Larsa, and in Isin we've got, for now, King Bur-Sin, and that's from his time frame, also with the cuneiform writing there. And then in Larsa, we have Sumu-la-El, who is right up here. So we've got, there's Mesopotamia. We zoom back out here. There's Larsa in the south. Oh, sorry about that. So Tower of Babel and Eridu there. Uruk was Nimrod's capital. So we've got Isin, we got Larsa over here, Isin over here, Assyria and Assur up over this area. And then we've got over right there, the young nation, city-state of Babylon with their first king. King is Samu-Abam. And Babylon is kind of in the top part here, about 11 miles from that place, Kish. So we are now moving forward. Oh, do not want to forget, we got a newbie. We got a new kid on the block. We have up here in Phoenicia, what's now Lebanon, in that area, over here in Byblos. We have a new city-state here with their first king, Ibshemuabi. He's over here, 128, yeah. So Ibshemuabi in Byblos. And Byblos will come up here in their interactions with Egypt. And that's an obelisk referencing this first king. So there we go. So now we are going to make our way over to China. And what happens in here? So before we get to Genesis 47, we will actually be seeing some events happen, shaking up around the world around them. So I've mentioned that Emperor Xi is the last emperor of the first dynasty of China, the Xia dynasty. Well, they in 1658 BC are being overthrown. And we have a new dynasty, all because of this man. This man known as Tang of Shang. So if you need a little something to pick up your drink, just put in some Tang of Shang.
There you go.
Yes. Here,
Astronauts use it.
right. So here is Mr. Tang of Shang. And again, this is an artist's depiction of him. So here, again, this is the time frame of Jacob and the whole family in Egypt under Amenemhat III. So what happened? This is, basically Wikipedia version of the events here. Some kind of blended in mythology, so we kind of try to screen and filter the truth from the embellishments and all that. But basically, this guy, Tang of Shang, is considered to be a virtuous ruler, good guy. His common nickname was Tang the Perfect. And according to legend, he's the one who overthrew Emperor Xi, last ruler of that Xia dynasty. Now, Tang ruled Shang, which was one of the many little kingdoms under the big kingdom empire of the Xia dynasty. And he'd been ruling there 17 years. But under Emperor Xi, Shang grew in power in his area. And he grew, and kind of the others around him were shrinking in their power and influence. He actually won supporters from as many as 40 of the smaller little kingdoms. Tang was recognizing Xi was mistreating his people, and he used that to kind of persuade and convince others. In a speech, he said that creating chaos was not something he wanted, but given how bad things were under Xi, he had to follow what he called the mandate of heaven. He had to use this opportunity to overthrow the Xia dynasty. And he even pointed out that Xi's own military generals are not obeying the emperor's orders. Everyone's recognizing this guy is no good. The chief historian, Zhonggu, fled away from Xi to go to the Shang. A few more tribes are starting to rebel against the Xia dynasty. So Tang of Shang decides, hey, the time has come. He starts his attacks. Xi hears of the rebellions, sends troops from these other territories, and there's kind of this back and forth a little bit here happen on. So an advisor, Yi Yin, tells Tang the army needs a boost in morale. He gives a famous speech known as Tang's Pledge. Not something you use on the furniture, but so he gave this pledge of support. The two armies met in a place called Mingtao, which in the present day is right over here where this battle took place. It's called Xia County now. over here in China. Right over in this area. So you've got all these other areas where that have been capitals at different times, kind of moved around. Again, there's North Korea, South Korea, Mongolia up there. So here we are in this Xia County area. So this big battle takes place in the hill country of this area here. I know we're from the Central Valley High Desert, so we're not used to seeing green, but yeah. So off in these hills, so this is where all that takes place. So Tang's generals and his soldiers, they all hated Emperor Xi, so they fought bravely. But on Xi's side, his troops, seeing the power of the Shangs, they didn't listen to their boss's commands. They surrendered, they fled. So the Shang army fought against Emperor Xi's Xia forces here at Mingtao during a heavy thunderstorm, and they won. So the Shangs won the battle, and now they set up the new dynasty, the Shang dynasty. So Emperor Xi ran away, escaped to a place called Sanzong. The Shang forces under General Wuzi pursued him, found him, captured him at Jiamen. They deposed him, they captured him, and the Xia dynasty is no more. Tang of Shang forces Xi into exile, a place called Nanchao, and Xi stays there until he eventually dies of an illness. So Tang has eliminated the remaining Xia forces, uses some of the Xia peasants as slaves, and now he's the ultimate king emperor and now leads the Shang dynasty. And again, Emperor Tang, first emperor of the Shang dynasty, they consider him a good emperor. He lowers taxes, he lowers the draft for the soldiers, and good influence spread around. He also establishes, during the moving back and forth, back over, let's see, he moves the capital back over to one we've seen a lot before, right there, yeah, Anyang. He makes that the new capital of the first capital of the Shang dynasty. So that's that over there. In fact, where's my mouse? There it is. So that's over in this area here. So a big deal, big turnover with the land of China. And so there's their new capital, kind of still in the region of all the others. So the Bamboo Annals, one of their historical records, they say Tang built a palace called Zishi to memorialize and honor the first dynasty, the Xia dynasty. First 5 years of his reign, there were several droughts, so Emperor Tang orders golden coins to be made and distributed to the poor families who were forced to sell their children because of the drought. So the idea is for them to use this money so they can buy their children back. And by the way, he's often drawn as being 9 feet tall, white-faced, whiskered man with a pointed head, 6 jointed arms, and a body that's markedly larger on one side than the other. I don't know if they had hired Picasso to do the job. I don't know, but whatever. But yeah, so that was that. So for us folks back in Egypt. No, he was just drawn that way. Kind of like Jessica Rabbit. I'm not bad. I'm just drawn that way. So 1657 BC, Egypt. Remember the Nile River had when the Nile River was overflooding more than average, it was, hey, this is giving us more minerals and good crops. But then when it overflowed too much, okay, now we got too much water, we can't plant, now we're in famine. So here in 1657 BC, we are back in the land of Goshen, the city that will be known as Avaris. Over here in the Egyptian Delta. So in 1657 BC, our patriarch Jacob is 134 years old. So if his twin brother Esau is still around, he's that age as well. So his son Judah is 47, Joseph is 44, Judah's son Perez is 17, and Perez's son Hezron in the line of Christ is about 4 years old here. So what's the big deal about 1657 BC? Well, this is the time now with Amenemhat III on his own. He's obviously still concerned for his people. He's relieved to see the famine is finally over. The 7 years of famine gone now. Those Nile flood levels are still high for a number of years, but the people under Joseph's guidance are able to adapt and produce food again. So things are kind of back to normal. So hooray, the famine has passed. Life is going to be getting back to normal here. So the year 1653 BC is the anniversary of Noah's flood. In fact, it has now been 1,300 years since Noah's flood. The very next year, 1652 BC, is the anniversary of the Tower of Babel. It is now 900 years since the Tower of Babel. We've got a few new kings shaking things up here before we get back to Genesis 47. We have a new king in Babylon, King Samulael. So let's go here. So he's over here in Babylon. We don't know a whole lot about Samulael. He did subjugate and conquer nearby cities like Kish, and he had a bunch of fortresses he had built around his territory, and that's pretty much what we know about this guy. He ruled from 1653 to 1618 BC. And over in Isin, we've got a new king in 1651. So this guy over here. Okay, back in Isin, up here, kind of in the middle of these Mesopotamia places. So King Lipit-Enlil, what do we know about this guy? He's their 8th king. He rules for 5 years, 1651, 1647 BC, son of Bursin. His brief reign ended a period that had some good stability, but kind of no more after this. They've got a temple of Ninurta. The temple lasted over 75 years. We've got fragments of records that show, hey, the economy around the temple was good, but it kind of soaked up a lot of the wealth from the other places. So yeah, lots of gifts to the temple there of their false god Enlil. Which brings us back to Egypt, down 1649 BC. Remember, they started this pattern of having the father bring on the son to co-reign with him. Well, now our friend Amenemhat III, Joseph's Pharaoh, brings on his son. Any guess what his name is, or what he gets to be known as? The son of Amenemhat III comes to co-reign with his dad as, you guessed it, Amenemhat IV. So 1649 BC, Amenemhat IV co-reigns with his father, Amenemhat III. And there's something from his time frame here. So what do we know about Amenemhat IV? Again, this is while Jacob and everyone is there in Egypt. He had sent out expeditions out into the Sinai Peninsula trying to get some turquoise. In the south of Egypt, he wanted to get some amethyst. He kept up trade relations with Byblos that we've just seen up in the north there, in the area what we know as Lebanon. And he continued maintaining Egyptian forces down in the south around Nubia. He built part of a temple to the cow god Hathor in that place in the Sinai, Serabet el-Kadim, where we found the first alphabet. His time frame seems to be pretty peaceful and uneventful. Trade relations were developed again with Byblos. Over there, they found an obsidian and gold chest and a jar lid that had Amenemhat IV's name on them. Yeah.
When you were saying there's the Pharaoh and his sons reigned with him.
Yeah.
I always thought that like the king had to die before a son could go into that position.
Great point.
But here you're saying that they ruled together.
Yep.
I never realized that.
Yeah. And great observation. And most of the time, you don't get the throne until your dad dies and now it's yours.
Right.
And there's a transition. Well, what happened in Egypt specifically, kicking off this high point middle kingdom, 12th dynasty, the first pharaoh of the 12th dynasty of a once again united Egypt was assassinated while the son was away. So there's kind of a palace coup kind of thing going on. So the son came back, dealt with all the uprisings and all that stuff, established himself as pharaoh, and they basically said, you know what, there's a better way to do this. So while things are good for the current pharaoh, let's bring on who his replacement's going to be, have him kind of established with him. The dad can kind of take a little bit of a back seat, but still have all the title and authority and all that stuff. The son will get his feet wet, get comfortable reigning. That way, when the father passes, it's just obvious and natural and no question or threat, for the son to take the reins and go from there. Kind of makes sense, yeah. So during the time of Joseph and the famine, them coming to Egypt, there were two pharaohs. The pharaoh we deal with in the Bible is the son, Amenemhat III, while the father, Senuseret III, was kind of taking the back seat, but still pharaoh. So he had died, and we covered that last week. So now the one who had been the son now brings on his son. This guy we're talking about here, Amenemhat IV.
Okay.
Yeah, so Amenemhat III is still around, but he's now taking the role of the dad pharaoh. Yeah, he's semi-retired. Yeah. And so training his son Amenemhat IV to be the new big guy. Vice president, yeah. And if he's not doing a good job, just send him off somewhere like Billy Car. But anyway, that's another story for another time. So he established trade, and we find these things with his name on them in other foreign places. There's a gold plaque showing the name of Amenemhat IV, making an offering to a deity that may have come from Byblos as well. So they're trading it by ships, going across the Mediterranean, as well as traveling up around the coast. So another thing I thought was kind of funny that this was mentioned here. Get this. Now remember, Europe's a continent, Asia's a continent. The land of Israel, which isn't theirs yet, remember they're still in Egypt right now, but the land of Canaan that they will eventually go to take over is on the continent of Asia. So people not from that continent looking over to it call those people Asiatics, not Asians as we think of like the Far East, but being from that continent of Asia. So they're called Asiatics, especially when you're on the continent of Africa, for example, like Egypt is. So during Amenemhat IV's time as pharaoh, along with his dad, Amenemhat III, get this, here's an observation. See if this makes sense to you. An influx, or the influx of Asiatic immigrants into the Nile Delta that started during the reigns of Amenemhat IV's predecessor accelerated under his own reign, becoming completely unchecked. What they're saying is, during the reign of Amenemhat IV, starting with his dad, you got a whole bunch of people coming over from this land of Canaan that are not Egyptian. These people coming over, and the people are multiplying, and they're starting to grow and becoming this big group here. I think we read that somewhere. Yeah, Genesis. So here we have secular records saying, hey, we noticed this is going on. But of course, because they don't accept the timing, they say, well, I can't be that. So there's that. One more thing, then we'll get to some Bible here. Assyria, new king. His name is Puzur-Assur II. Becomes king of Assyria, which is over here. Number.
This is kind of the subject.
Please, fire away.
But who and where, what was the time frame of when they found the soldiers under the ground? And there was a lot of them, like when the king died, they were
yes,
put in these, but they had the faces of themselves, but they had to die too.
Yeah. What Sister Peggy is asking about and referring to, this happened a lot. We're in Dynasty 12 right now of Egypt. What happened in earlier dynasties in Egypt, as well as like we're talking first and second dynasty, as well in the fourth too a little bit, but also it happened somewhat in the early days of Mesopotamia as well, where you have servant and soldier sacrifices when the pharaoh died, and they would be buried with the king. You don't want the poor guy to go into the afterlife and underworld alone, So and you see, it's sad how Egypt was such a cult of death.
Yeah.
And an emphasis on death, where Christianity is the exact opposite. And we're in our Judeo-Christian faith, we're a cult of life, very much, not even cult, but yeah, obviously you see what we're talking about here. And so, because they were so focused on death, these grand pyramids were monuments to death. Those were tombs. The pharaohs were buried there. And it was all about preparing the pharaoh for his journey across the river back over to the island of Bahrain, where he'd be rising with the sun and this whole thing. And so they had all this preparation for him. When part of the embalming process and mummification, they take some of the vital organs out and put them in jars. They're called canopic jars. So they're kind of keeping them safe, for and all this stuff. They even packed extra underwear for them for the new, Oh yeah. So they were very death focused. So, but that was it's been several centuries now since that, probably maybe even close to 1,000 years since.
But we
that
only
was-
uncovered them, what, about 15, 20 years ago? Or has it been a lot longer than that?
So when did we start uncovering this? Y'all have heard of Napoleon from France? Well, and Thomas Jefferson, our third president, the Louisiana Purchase was from Napoleon of France,
Right.
because he needed, money for his ambitions. Egyptology, Egyptian archaeology began under Napoleon during the time of Thomas Jefferson. So we're talking 1800s.
Okay.
So
Not that long ago.
this is all within the last 200 years.
And we can still go see, I mean, we can go see.
The Sphinx, as one example, was completely buried in sand. This has just been unearthed and discovered. So this is why, as much info as we've uncovered, it's still, to use the phrase, rags and tatters compared to all that was and all that was there. It's just more better preserved here because it's not the swampland of the Mediterranean, of the Persian Gulf and
that's
Mesopotamia.
very interesting. Oh, I'm sorry.
No, this is the middle of ours, so go ahead.
Where you were showing, because, we can tell by trees, if you cut a
Tree
tree
rings.
down, the tree rings. And when you were doing it with the land.
Mhm. Going underground and hit the layers,
Yeah.
digging down to go
And
back in
you
time.
can tell by the different.
A lot of things we use are like the pottery styles and the art expressions from different time frames.
The land was
Yeah,
red and gray.
yep, different layers, soils.
Rock,
Yep,
and I found that very fascinating.
exactly. In different climates, the people are living in different areas. Yeah, good stuff. Brother Peter.
I'm kind of confused when you said, now, which one, there was one that, on the statues that were buried?
The soldiers that were buried. Yes, soldiers that were killed and sacrificed and buried, and servants and buried to go to the afterlife along with their pharaoh.
Okay, that's for Egypt?
Egypt did that in their early dynasties. And then there are other folks in Mesopotamia who've done servant burials and things like that too.
Because I seen one the other day, it was the Chinese, they had a bunch of, it was, I don't know, Japanese or Chinese, it was those soldiers. They were
Yep.
gold.
Oh, yeah.
It was on Google the other day, and I've seen it before, but I didn't brought it up again. So is that's not the same one?
Not the same one, but similar. In fact, there's one in the Orient who had a very famous clay army. They uncovered that may have been it, where they were standing at attention with their weapons and everything. There's like a gazillion, I'm of course exaggerating, but a shocking number of these clay soldiers, there to be with their leader as he goes on from there.
That's what that's
Yeah,
what I was thinking, that
yeah.
thing, but I didn't know
Yeah,
it was more.
similar idea, and I would rather be on the Chinese or Japanese. I'd rather be on that side of it where they're just using clay representations. Where,
Right.
yeah, we'll see later on that there were the one queen of Egypt had a whole bunch of cats mummified to go along with her. Guess she's a crazy cat lady, but yeah, even back then, yes. And so
Not alone.
there we go. So here we are, moving forward in time. We are now in 1648 BC. We have new king in Assyria, Puzur-Assur II. He's the son and successor of Sargon I. But because Sargon I lived for so long, Queen Elizabeth, he came to the throne at an old age. In fact, he was so old when he became king. How old was he? He was so old that one of his sons was a grown-up who was able to sign as a witness on contract 11 years before his dad became king, when his dad finally kicked the bucket, Sargon I. So like King Charles III, Puzur-Assur is only king for a short time because he got to the throne at such a late age in life because his parent reigned for so long before him. So that brings us to the Bible, to about the year 1648 BC. Now hold your place in Genesis 47. Go with me. Let's travel to First Chronicles chapter 7. Something a little interesting mentioned here. First Chronicles chapter 7. We see in the line of Joseph, and this is actually going to be the line from Joseph to Joshua. Joshua is a direct descendant of Joseph. And so we see some genealogies were given, some were not, were given Joshua's. So Joshua comes from Joseph, and we'll see part of that line here. It works out to be about 1648 BC now. So in First Chronicles chapter 7, kind of interesting thing happens here. If I get there myself. Here we are. First Chronicles 7. Let's pick up in verse 20. So just a couple verses. First Chronicles 7, verse 20, dealing with Joseph's son, Ephraim, who will be one of the 12 tribes of Israel. First Chronicles 7:20, the sons of Ephraim were Shuthelah and Bered his son, Tahath his son, Elidah his son, Tahath his son, Zabad his son, Shuthelah his son, Ezer, Eliad, whom the men of Gath who were born in the land killed because they came down to take their livestock. Their father Ephraim mourned for many days for them. His relatives came to comfort him. Then he went into his wife. She conceived, gave birth to a son, named him Beriah, because misfortune had come upon his house. So after the tragedy with loss of some of his children, Beriah is born out of all that, and Beriah will be the one through whom Joshua comes. So a little more life is happening and continuing as we go here. We got two more quick kings to address, and then we'll get back to Genesis 47. So now in the year 1646 BC, we have a new king in Isin as time marches on here. This king is named Irraimiti, if I'm pronouncing that right. 68. So here we are. Back over there in Isin. So Irraimiti, known for the legendary tale of his death. It was referred to as a, quote, gastronomic mishap. Gastronomic has to do with our tummies. So he destroyed the city wall of Kazalu, a city that was with Larsa. Hello, welcome. With Larsa and sort of an antagonist to Isin. So Isin and Babylon are buddies over here. Kazalu and Larsa are buddies over there, and they're kind of fussing and fighting with each other. So his conquest of Kisura escalated the hostilities against Larsa. So this new king in Isin, he's really having some hostile interactions with the other folks. Now here's something funny that happens. We talk about these different cultures and traditions. So here's one for these folks at this time. So they have their omens, they have their soothsayers, they have their guys, reading the signs and wonders and trying to predict things. When the omens predict an impending doom for a monarch, it was a custom to appoint a substitute as a statue through animate, basically a scapegoat. Okay, well, there's some bad juju in the air for the king, so let's put someone else there to stand in the king's place. So if lightning's going to strike, let it strike them and not the actual king. Yeah, I don't think they had many volunteers for this role. But the scapegoat stood in place for the king, but did not exercise power. But he was on the throne for like 100 days until the disaster passed. And then when all was passed, everything was good, then him and his spouse would be ritually slaughtered and the king would take his throne. Okay, thank you for standing in place when the danger was. So your services no longer required. And back to the king. Well, funny thing happens here with Isin and this king, Irraimiti. He orders Enlil-bani, the gardener, to be the one to sit on the throne as a royal substitute, put the crown of kingship on his head. But then, turns out it is the king himself who dies in his palace. He dies while swallowing hot porridge in little sips. So the gardener, Enlil-bani, sitting on the throne, doesn't give the throne up and becomes the new king later on.
I wouldn't have gave it up either. I'd be like,
Yeah. So that's that. So then over in, so that's what happens in Isin. So they've got their king, Irraimiti, or however that's pronounced, until we read about how he ends up dying later on. And over in Byblos, we've got another new king, this guy, named Ibshemuabi, however that's pronounced. He takes the throne in 1645, reigns for 40 years. Over up here in Byblos, one place we talked about last week. So, all of those events bring us to the very critical year for the Lord's people and for the book of Genesis, 1644. We are going to be in the year 1644 for quite some time. These are the last days of Jacob, also known as Israel. So this brings us back to Avaris in the land of Egypt. So this brings us back to Genesis 47. Let's see, number 28. So in the year 1644 BC, Jacob is now 147 years old. Judah is now 60. Joseph is 57 years old. And I just kind of caught this as I was preparing this. Joseph has now been in Egypt for 50 years. He came at 17. He's now, 40 years. That makes it even more interesting because he came at 17. 40 is an interesting number in the Bible. I describe it as a period of gestation, a birthing process. It's almost like a cocoon. There's a before and after. You come out the other side differently with 40 days and 40 nights with the flood. 40 weeks is a period of gestation for us human folks, our pregnancy.
How old was Joseph when he was?
He was sold out by his brothers at 17 years old. And he's now been in Egypt for 40 years. So he's now 57 when after the father and family he brought in, now these are the last days of his father. So his father's 147, his brother Judah is 60, Joseph is 57. He's been in Egypt 40 years now. Joseph's nephew Perez, son of Judah, is about 30, Hezron about 17. So Judah, Perez, Hezron, that's going down the line of Christ. So Genesis 47. Let's take a look at the last days of Jacob. Genesis 47, we will pick up in verse 28. Genesis 47:28. Jacob lived in the land of Egypt for 17 years. So the length of Jacob's life was 147 years. When the time came for Israel to die, when the time for Israel to die drew near, he called his son Joseph and said to him, "Please, if I have found favor in your sight, place your hand under my thigh now and deal with me in kindness and faithfulness. Please do not bury me in Egypt. But when I lie down with my fathers, you shall carry me out of Egypt and bury me in their burial place." And he said, "I will do as you have said." And he said, "Swear to me." So he swore to him. Then Israel bowed in worship at the head of the bed. So Israel realizes that Jacob realizes his time is coming to an end. He calls Joseph over and asks of him, "Bury me not on the lone prairie. Don't bury me here in Egypt with these folks. Bring me my body out of Egypt. Bury me with our people in our place." And so he makes Joseph swear to it. Putting the hand under someone's thigh, and that culture and custom back then was just an intimacy showing of we're taking this seriously and we are going to honor this. Mentions in verse 28, Jacob had been in the land of Egypt for 17 years. And I find it interesting that he had, for Joseph's first 17 years of life were with his father Jacob until he was taken away. And now the last 17 years of Jacob's life are reunited with Joseph. So the first 17 and the last 17, Jacob gets to spend with his son Joseph. So we also have, let's see, we'll pause here and pick up in chapter 48 next week. But I do want to notice in verse 31, I think this is important not to overlook. So after Joseph promised that as Jacob is dying here, Joseph promised he would take his body to be with his parents and his families in that place and not be buried in this foreign land. Verse 31 of Genesis 47, he said, "Swear to me." So he swore to him. Then Israel bowed in worship at the head of the bed. What I appreciate about this is a couple times, even after God changed his name from Jacob to Israel, we still see him referred to as Jacob in a lot of places. And I still call him Jacob just to say, hey, we're talking about the man, not the nation yet. But you don't see that with someone like once Abram is Abraham, you never see Abram again. Now with Saul and Paul, it was never a name change. It's just when he's with the Gentiles, that's his Gentile name. When he's with the Jews, Saul's his name. So we don't see that. But with so many of these people, once there's a name change, you never go back. But with Jacob, you kind of see just that clarification. My point is here, it's very intentional that this is Israel. he is departing this life as the man whom God has changed. And who is the instrument from whom the patriarch, through whom the 12 nations are going to go out and be that nation, be that people under the king of God, with God as their king in the promised land to come, as he will lead them out. So very significant that Israel bowed in worship here. So knowing that his time has come, his life has been fulfilled, he's got the promise and assurance from his son Joseph, his body's going to be taken care of. Okay, now I can breathe. Now all said and done. Now there's nothing left but to worship God. Then we'll see after this. Okay, and bringing the other sons, I got to talk to them a bit. And we'll have that conversation when we pick up next week. So any thoughts, reactions, observations, questions of these things that we have looked at across the passing of time while they are in Egypt? All good? And we will call it a day for our Sunday school class. We'll stop our share, stop our recording, and get ready to go to the Lord with our